The sound of coins hitting the wooden collection plate echoed through the silent church like thunder. 3 copper pennies. That was all Margaret had to give. She stood there, trembling, her weathered hands empty now, while 200 pairs of eyes watched from the pews. Then Pastor Vincent's voice cut through the silence like a blade dipped in poison. 3 pennies? Sister, perhaps you should have stayed home and spared us the embarrassment. Laughter erupted. But what happened next would shake that congregation to its very foundation and expose a darkness no one saw coming. Margaret had been coming to Riverside Community Church for 47 years. She'd watched 3 pastors come and go, seen the building expand from a small wooden chapel to a sprawling complex with stained glass windows that caught the morning light like fragments of heaven. She'd buried her husband Thomas in the cemetery behind the sanctuary, next to the old oak tree, where they'd carved their initials as teenagers. That was 32 years ago. Since then, every Sunday morning, she walked the same 3 miles from her tiny apartment above the hardware store, her Bible clutched against her chest like a shield against the world's cruelty. But everything had changed when Pastor Vincent arrived 2 years earlier. He came with credentials that impressed the elders, a degree from a prestigious seminary, experience leading megachurches in 3 different states, a smile that could melt hearts, and a voice that could command armies. Within 6 months, he'd tripled the congregation. Within a year, he'd raised enough money to build a new education wing. The people loved him. They hung on his every word. They competed for his attention like children desperate for approval from a distant father. Margaret noticed things others didn't. The way his sermons always circled back to money. The way his eyes glazed over the poorer members of the congregation, lingering instead on those who wore expensive watches and drove luxury cars. The way he spoke about prosperity as if poverty were a personal failing, a sign of insufficient faith. But she said nothing. Who would listen to an old widow anyway? She was just part of the furniture, as invisible as the hymnals stacked in the back pew. That Sunday morning started like any other. Margaret woke before dawn, heated water on her ancient stove for instant coffee, and counted the coins in the glass jar she kept beside her bed. $3.47. That was all that remained until her next Social Security check arrived in 5 days. She needed money for bread, for the electric bill that threatened disconnection, for the medicine that kept her heart beating in some semblance of rhythm. But it was the first Sunday of the month, and she'd made a promise to Thomas on his deathbed. No matter what, she would give her offering, even if it meant going hungry. She chose 3 pennies, not because that was all she could spare, but because in her heart, she knew those 3 copper coins represented everything. Her faith, her devotion, her hope that God saw beyond the poverty and recognized the sacrifice. She wrapped them in a tissue, placed them in her worn purse, and began the long walk to church. The autumn wind bit through her thin coat, and her knees ached with every step, but she pressed forward. The church bells were ringing when she finally pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The sanctuary was packed, more crowded than she'd ever seen it. Pastor Vincent had announced a special sermon series on prosperity and breakthrough, and people had come from neighboring towns to hear him speak. Margaret found a spot in the very back row, squeezed between a young couple who smelled of expensive cologne and a businessman who kept checking his phone. She bowed her head and prayed, asking God to bless the offering she was about to give, to multiply it somehow, to see the intention behind the poverty. When the collection plates began making their rounds, Margaret watched as people dropped in crisp bills, 20s, 50s, some folded hundreds. The man beside her wrote a check with so many zeros it made her dizzy. The young couple tossed in what looked like their entire week's earnings, smiling as if they'd just won the lottery. And then the plate reached Margaret. Her hand shook as she unwrapped the tissue and let the 3 pennies fall. The sound they made seemed impossibly loud. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind through wheat. The usher who held the plate stared at the coins, then at Margaret, then back at the coins. His face registered something between pity and disgust. He moved on quickly, but the damage was done. Margaret felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floorboards and vanish into the earth below. But she remained seated, her spine straight, her eyes fixed on the wooden cross hanging above the altar. She'd done what she came to do. God saw. That was enough. Pastor Vincent stood at the pulpit, watching the collection plates being brought forward. He was a tall man with silver hair, perfectly styled, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Margaret's entire year of rent. When the ushers placed the plates before him, he made a show of looking through them, nodding approvingly at the larger donations, his smile widening with each $100 bill. Then he stopped. His fingers picked up 3 copper pennies. He held them up to the light, squinting as if trying to determine whether they were real or some kind of joke. "Brothers and sisters," his voice boomed through the microphone, "I want to share something with you this morning, a teaching moment, if you will." He held the pennies higher. "Someone in this congregation today gave exactly 3 cents to the Lord's work. 3 pennies, the cost of absolutely nothing in today's world." Nervous laughter scattered through the crowd. Margaret's stomach turned to ice. "Now I want to ask a serious question. If you can only afford 3 pennies, should you really be taking up space in God's house? Should you really be consuming resources that could go to those who actually contribute?" The laughter grew louder, more confident. People craned their necks, looking around to see who the guilty party might be. Margaret's face burned with shame. She wanted to stand, to defend herself, to explain that those 3 pennies represented everything she had, but her voice caught in her throat. Her legs refused to move. She was paralyzed by humiliation, drowning in a sea of mocking faces. "I'm not trying to be cruel," Pastor Vincent continued, his tone dripping with false compassion. "I'm trying to teach biblical principles. God loves a cheerful giver, yes, but he also expects us to give proportionally. 3 pennies? That's not giving. That's insulting. It's like spitting in God's face and calling it worship." He dropped the coins back into the plate with exaggerated disdain. "If you're the person who gave this pathetic offering, I want you to know something. You're not fooling anyone. Poverty is a choice. It's a result of poor decisions and lack of faith. Don't come in here expecting blessings when you refuse to sow seeds of abundance." The church erupted in applause. People stood clapping and shouting amens. They loved this kind of sermon, the kind that made them feel superior to someone else, the kind that justified their wealth and condemned others' poverty. Margaret sat frozen, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. She'd never felt so small, so worthless, so completely unseen. This wasn't the church she'd loved for nearly 5 decades. This was something else entirely, something dark, wearing the mask of holiness. But then, something strange happened. In the second row, an elderly man stood up. His name was Bernard, and he'd been a deacon for 30 years. He walked slowly toward the front, his cane tapping against the tile floor. The applause died down. Pastor Vincent watched him approach with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. Bernard stopped at the pulpit, turned to face the congregation, and in a voice that trembled with age but carried the weight of conviction, he said, "I know who gave those 3 pennies, and you should all be ashamed of yourselves." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Bernard continued, "That was Margaret Sutton. Some of you young folks don't know her, but she's been the heartbeat of this church longer than most of you have been alive. When my wife was dying of cancer, Margaret sat with her every single night for 3 months. She cooked meals for us, cleaned our house, prayed over us until her knees bled. When the Johnson family lost everything in that fire, Margaret gave them the only winter coat she owned. When Pastor Reynolds had his heart attack, she organized the entire care schedule, making sure someone was with his family around the clock." Bernard's voice grew stronger, fueled by righteous anger. "And you want to know something else? Those 3 pennies probably represent her entire week's food budget. I see her at the discount grocery store, buying day-old bread and dented cans. I've seen her mending the same dress for 5 years because she can't afford a new one. But she walks 3 miles to this church every Sunday, rain or shine, because her faith is real. Not because it's convenient, not because it makes her feel good about herself, because she genuinely loves God and believes in this community." Pastor Vincent's face had gone pale. He tried to interject, "Brother Bernard, I think you're overreacting." But the old deacon wasn't finished. "Shall you stand up here in your $1,000 suit, preaching about sacrifice and faith, and you mock a widow who gave everything she had? Do you even know what that means? Do you have any concept of real poverty? Real sacrifice? That woman has more faith in her little finger than this entire congregation combined." The businessman who'd been sitting next to Margaret suddenly stood up. "I wrote a check for $5,000 today," he announced loudly. "I did it because I wanted recognition. I wanted Pastor Vincent to mention my name from the pulpit like he always does. I wanted people to think I'm generous. But you know what? My company made $7 million last quarter. That 5,000 meant nothing to me. Less than nothing. It was like tossing spare change into a fountain and making a wish. Margaret gave 3 pennies, and it meant everything. Who really honored God here today?" One by one, people began standing. A woman in the middle section with tears running down her face. "I gave $50 and spent $200 on this outfit, so people would think I'm doing well. Margaret wore the same dress she's worn for years and gave from her poverty. I'm ashamed." A young man near the front. "I pledged $100 a month to the building fund and then turned away a homeless person asking for food outside. What kind of Christian does that make me?" The confessions poured out like water from a broken dam. People admitting their hypocrisy, their greed, their judgment. The perfect facade of Riverside Community Church was cracking, revealing the rot underneath. And through it all, Margaret sat in her back pew, overwhelmed and confused. She hadn't wanted this. She never sought attention or vindication. She'd simply given what she could and expected nothing in return. That's what faith looked like to her. Quiet, humble, unconcerned with recognition. Pastor Vincent stood at the pulpit, his commanding presence diminishing with each passing moment. He looked like a man watching his empire crumble in real time. "Brothers and sisters," he tried again, his voice lacking its usual authority, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I wasn't targeting anyone specifically. I was making a general theological point about..." But no one was listening anymore. The spell was broken. The curtain had been pulled back and they'd seen the wizard was just a man drunk on power and profit. Bernard turned to Margaret and extended his hand. "Sister Margaret, would you please come up here?" She shook her head violently, shrinking back into her seat. The last thing she wanted was more attention, but people around her began encouraging her, gentle hands on her shoulders, soft voices saying it was okay, that she deserved to be honored. Slowly, reluctantly, she stood. Her legs felt like water. The walk to the front seemed to take hours. Every step was agony. Every eye felt like a laser burning through her soul. When she finally reached the front, Bernard embraced her. She was so small and frail in his arms, like a bird made of paper and wishes. He held her for a long moment, and she began to sob. Not from sadness, but from a release of decades of invisibility, of being overlooked and undervalued, of pouring herself out in service and receiving nothing but silence in return. Bernard whispered in her ear, "You are seen, Margaret. God sees you. We see you now, and we're sorry it took us so long." Pastor Vincent stood off to the side, visibly uncomfortable. His carefully constructed image was disintegrating. The congregation that had hung on his every word now looked at him with suspicion and disappointment. He cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Well, this has certainly been an unexpected turn of events. Perhaps we should all take a moment to reflect on what's transpired here today." His words sounded hollow, rehearsed, devoid of genuine emotion. It was the voice of a performer who'd lost his audience. But the morning's revelations were far from over. A woman named Dorothy stood up from the third row. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, someone Margaret recognized as a regular volunteer in the church kitchen. "I need to say something," Dorothy announced, her voice shaking. 3 months ago I lost my job. My husband left me. I was about to lose my house. I came to Pastor Vincent privately and asked if the church had any emergency funds that could help me get through until I found work. Do you know what he told me? The church held its breath. Dorothy continued, tears streaming down her face. He told me that my financial problems were a result of spiritual deficiency, that if I had enough faith, God would provide. He suggested I increase my giving, not decrease it, that I should write a check for $1,000 as a seed of faith and watch God multiply it. I was desperate, so I did it. I wrote that check, even though it meant I couldn't pay my mortgage that month. And you know what happened? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I lost my house anyway. I've been living in my car for the past 6 weeks, showering at the gym, pretending everything is fine while I sit in these pews every Sunday. The gasps that rippled through the congregation were audible. Pastor Vincent's face had gone from pale to red. "Sister Dorothy, those were private conversations. This isn't the appropriate forum." But she cut him off. "Private? You want to talk about privacy? You humiliated Margaret in front of 200 people for giving 3 pennies. You made her poverty a spectacle. Well, now you can deal with yours, the poverty of your compassion, the bankruptcy of your character. More people began sharing their stories. A single mother who'd been told her son's illness was punishment for her lack of faith. An elderly couple who'd given their entire retirement savings to the building fund because Pastor Vincent promised God would repay them tenfold. A young man who'd been shamed for being unemployed and told he wasn't welcome to serve in ministry until he got his life together. Story after story of manipulation, spiritual abuse, and exploitation. Margaret listened in horror. She'd known something was wrong, but she'd had no idea how deep the corruption ran. These weren't isolated incidents. This was systematic, a pattern of predatory behavior disguised as pastoral care. Pastor Vincent had built his empire on the backs of the vulnerable, extracting their last dollars while convincing them it was God's will. The revelation made her physically ill. She gripped Bernard's arm for support, her legs threatening to give out. Pastor Vincent tried one final time to assert control. You're all being manipulated by the enemy right now. Satan wants to destroy this ministry, to tear apart what God has built here. Don't let a few isolated complaints. But he didn't get to finish. A young man in the sound booth suddenly spoke into the microphone. Pastor, I think the congregation needs to hear something. The young man's name was Daniel, and he'd been working as the church's media director for 18 months. I've been recording every service, every meeting, every conversation that happens in this building. It's part of my job. And in the process, I've accidentally captured things that I don't think were meant to be public. He pulled out his laptop, fingers flying over the keys. Like this conversation from last month's elders' meeting. Pastor Vincent's voice boomed through the sanctuary speakers, crystal clear. We need to push the congregation harder on giving. I've analyzed the numbers, and at least 40% of our members are giving less than 5% of their income. That's unacceptable. I want you to start keeping track of who gives what. We'll begin recognizing top givers from the pulpit and subtly marginalizing those who aren't pulling their weight. Make them feel uncomfortable. Make them feel like they don't belong until they open their wallets. The recording played on. Elder Robert's voice. Pastor, isn't that a bit manipulative? Some of our members are genuinely struggling financially. Pastor Vincent's laugh was cold. Struggling is a choice. Anyone can make money if they're willing to work hard enough and have faith. Besides, we're running a business here, not a charity. If people aren't contributing to the bottom line, why are we wasting resources on them? The sanctuary exploded. People shouting, some crying, others demanding answers. Pastor Vincent's face had gone through every shade of the emotional spectrum and landed on pure panic. That recording is taken out of context, he stammered. How you don't understand the full... But Daniel wasn't finished. There's more. Conversations about using the building fund money for your personal expenses, emails about manipulating the financial reports presented to the board, text messages about targeting wealthy widows for large donations, and then cutting off contact once you got what you wanted. Margaret felt the room spinning. The church she'd loved for nearly 50 years had been rotting from the inside, and she'd been too close to see it. Or maybe she had seen it and chosen to ignore it, because facing the truth was too painful. Either way, the scales had fallen from her eyes now. The man standing at the pulpit wasn't a shepherd. He was a wolf in expensive clothing, feeding on the flock he was supposed to protect. Bernard stepped forward again, his voice steady despite his age. Pastor Vincent, I think it's time for you to leave. Not just the service, the church. Your employment here is terminated effective immediately. The elders will meet this afternoon to discuss next steps, but your tenure at Riverside Community Church is over. A handful of people applauded. Others sat in stunned silence. The morning had started as a normal Sunday service and transformed into something no one could have predicted. Pastor Vincent gathered his Bible and notes with shaking hands. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage. As he walked down from the pulpit, he paused next to Margaret. For a moment she thought he might apologize. Instead, he leaned close and whispered, so only she could hear, "This is your fault, you pathetic old woman. You and your 3 pennies destroyed everything I built." Then he was gone, storming through the side door, his footsteps echoing long after he'd vanished. Margaret stood there, processing his words. Part of her wanted to believe he was right, that somehow she'd caused this catastrophe, but Bernard's hand on her shoulder anchored her. "None of this is your fault," he said firmly. "You exposed what was already there. You held up a mirror and he couldn't stand what he saw reflected back. That's on him, not you." The congregation didn't know what to do. People milled about, some crying, some angry, some relieved. Bernard suggested they take a break and reconvene in an hour to discuss moving forward. Most people left the sanctuary, gathering in small groups in the parking lot. But Margaret remained seated in the front pew, staring at the empty pulpit. So much had been said, so much had been revealed, yet she felt oddly empty. Justice had been served, perhaps, but at what cost? A little boy approached her. He couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with a mop of curly brown hair and freckles scattered across his nose. He held something in his small fist. "Ma'am," he said shyly, "my mom told me what happened, about your 3 pennies. I want to give you something." He opened his hand, revealing a crumpled dollar bill and a handful of change. "It's all I have from my birthday money, but I want you to have it, because you gave everything." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She took the boy's hand and gently closed his fingers back around the money. "Sweet child, you keep that. Use it for something that makes you happy. The gift is in your wanting to give it. That's enough for me." The boy smiled, a gap-toothed grin that reminded her of her own grandson who lived 3 states away and rarely called. He hugged her quickly, then ran back to his mother. One by one, people began returning to the sanctuary, not to resume the service, but to talk. Really talk. For perhaps the first time in years, the congregation engaged in honest conversation. They discussed how they'd allowed themselves to be manipulated, how they'd prioritized appearance over authenticity, how they'd judged others while excusing their own failings. It was messy and painful and beautiful all at once. The kind of community they'd always claimed to be but never actually were. An impromptu meeting formed. Bernard, despite his age and initial reluctance, found himself leading the discussion. "We have a choice to make," he told the gathered crowd. "We can let this scandal destroy us, scatter to different churches, pretend it never happened, or we can use it as an opportunity to rebuild something genuine, something that actually reflects the teachings we claim to follow. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, but it might be worth it." Dorothy stood up again. "I vote we rebuild, but differently this time. No more celebrity pastors, no more emphasis on building campaigns and budget goals. Let's focus on actually helping people. Let's become the kind of church where someone like Margaret is honored instead of humiliated, where someone like me would have been helped instead of exploited." Her words resonated. People nodded. A few voiced their agreement. The energy in the room shifted from grief and anger to something that resembled hope. They voted that afternoon. Not on a new pastor or a new vision statement. They voted on immediate action items. First, create an emergency fund specifically for members in crisis. Second, implement transparent financial reporting, accessible to anyone who wanted to review it. Third, establish accountability measures to prevent future abuse. Fourth, reach out to everyone who'd been hurt by Pastor Vincent's ministry and offer genuine apologies and practical support. Margaret watched all of this unfold with a sense of wonder. Her 3 pennies had started as an act of private devotion. She'd never intended to spark a revolution, yet here they were. A congregation tearing down false idols and attempting to build something true. She thought about Pastor Vincent's parting words, his claim that she'd destroyed what he'd built. Perhaps she had, but maybe some things needed to be destroyed. Maybe sometimes you had to burn down the corrupt structure before you could lay a proper foundation. As evening approached and people finally began to leave, Margaret found herself alone in the sanctuary once more. The autumn sun streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the walls in shades of amber and gold. She walked slowly to the altar, placed her hand on the wooden rail where she'd knelt countless times over the decades. "I don't understand why you chose me for this," she whispered into the silence. "I'm nobody, just an old widow with 3 pennies." But even as she said it, she realized the truth. That was precisely why. Because she had nothing to lose, no reputation to protect, no image to maintain, no agenda beyond simple faithfulness. She'd given 3 pennies because that was all she had. And in doing so, she'd given everything. And somehow, mysteriously, that everything had been enough to break through decades of pretense and pride. Bernard found her there 20 minutes later. "I wanted to make sure you had a ride home," he said gently. Margaret smiled. That's kind of you, but I always walk. It's good for me. He shook his head. Not today. Today you're getting a ride. And tomorrow some of us are meeting to figure out how to make sure you don't have to walk 3 miles every Sunday anymore. Maybe we can organize a rotation of drivers. Maybe we can help you find something closer. The point is, you're not invisible anymore, Margaret. We see you, and we're not looking away again. The drive to her small apartment was quiet. Bernard didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. He simply drove, occasionally glancing over at the elderly woman beside him, marveling at the strength hidden in such a frail frame. When they pulled up in front of the hardware store, Margaret turned to him. Do you think any good will actually come from today? Or will people forget in a week and go back to the way things were? Bernard considered the question carefully. I honestly don't know. People are people. We're forgetful and selfish and easily distracted. But I do know this. Something shifted today. A crack appeared in the facade. And once you've seen through the illusion, it's hard to unsee it. So maybe some people will forget. Maybe some will leave. But those who stay, they'll be different. You made sure of that. That night, Margaret sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea and the jar of remaining coins. She counted them again. $3.44. Still not enough for the electric bill. Still not enough for a week's worth of groceries, but somehow it felt like more than it had that morning, as if the value of money had fundamentally changed. Or maybe she'd changed. Maybe she'd learned that worth wasn't measured in copper and paper, but in courage and conviction. Her phone rang, a rare occurrence. It was her grandson, Michael, the one who lived 3 states away and rarely called. Grandma? His voice sounded strange. I just saw a video. Someone posted what happened at your church today. It's going viral. There are millions of views, and everyone's talking about you, about your 3 pennies. Margaret didn't understand what viral meant or how a video could be seen by millions, but she understood the emotion in her grandson's voice. Pride. When was the last time anyone had been proud of her? I'm coming to visit, Michael continued. This weekend. I should have visited years ago. I should have called more, checked on you, made sure you were okay. But I got busy with work and life and stupid things that don't matter. And today I watched that video and realized I don't even know you. Not really. I know you're my grandmother, but I don't know your stories, your struggles, your faith. I want to change that, if you'll let me, Margaret cried. Not the tears of humiliation she'd shed that morning, but tears of unexpected joy. I'd like that very much, she managed to say. They talked for over an hour. He asked about her life, her memories of his grandfather, her experiences at the church. She told him stories she'd never shared before, and he listened like every word was precious. When they finally hung up, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Connection. The sense of being truly known by another person. The following days brought changes Margaret couldn't have imagined. The video of the church confrontation had indeed gone viral. News outlets picked up the story. Reporters called asking for interviews. A local businessman who'd seen the coverage showed up at her door with a check for $5,000. I don't go to church, he explained, but I respect real faith when I see it. Use this however you need. She tried to refuse, but he insisted, leaving it on her doorstep and driving away before she could argue further. More donations came. Small amounts from people across the country who'd been moved by her story. $20 from a college student, $50 from a retired teacher, $100 from a single mother who said Margaret's example had inspired her to keep going. Margaret didn't know what to do with the money. She'd lived in poverty so long that abundance felt foreign, almost threatening. Bernard helped her open a bank account and suggested she use some for her immediate needs and save the rest for emergencies or to help others. The church began its transformation slowly. They brought in a retired pastor from a neighboring town to serve as interim shepherd. He was everything Vincent wasn't. Humble, gentle, genuinely interested in people's well-being rather than their wallets. Attendance dropped initially as some members left, uncomfortable with the changes or embarrassed by what had been exposed. But those who remained were committed. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work, rebuilding their community on a foundation of authenticity instead of appearance. Dorothy got help finding a new apartment and a job. The church's emergency fund, funded by redirected building money, covered her first month's rent and utilities. The single mother whose son had been sick received assistance with medical bills. The elderly couple who'd given away their retirement got financial counseling and support. Slowly, painfully, the congregation learned what it meant to actually care for each other instead of just talking about it. Margaret found herself in an uncomfortable position, accidentally famous. People recognized her at the grocery store. They wanted to take pictures with her, to hear her story firsthand. She hated the attention, retreating further into herself whenever possible, but Bernard gently pushed her to accept that she'd become a symbol of something larger than herself. "You don't have to like it," he told her, "but you do have to acknowledge that God used your obedience to speak to thousands of people. Don't diminish that gift by hiding from it." 6 months after that fateful Sunday, Riverside Community Church held a special service. They'd spent the intervening time in intensive reflection and rebuilding. Now they wanted to recommit themselves to their community and their faith, but differently this time. Authentically. The sanctuary was full again, but the faces were different. Some were new people attracted by the church's transformation. Others were old members who'd returned after seeing genuine change. Bernard invited Margaret to share her testimony. She resisted at first, insisting she had nothing important to say, but eventually she agreed. Standing at that same pulpit where Pastor Vincent had mocked her, she spoke in a quiet voice that nonetheless filled the space. "I don't think of myself as brave," she began. "I was terrified that morning, humiliated. I wanted to disappear. But somewhere in that pain I remembered why I gave those 3 pennies in the first place. Not for recognition, not even for my own spiritual benefit. I gave them because I loved God, and I trusted that He saw my heart, even if no one else did." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the pulpit. "I've learned something these past months. Real faith isn't about the size of your gift or the eloquence of your prayers or how many people see you serving. It's about showing up. It's about giving what you have, even when it seems insignificant. It's about believing that God can use anything, even 3 copper pennies, to accomplish His purposes. I didn't set out to change this church. I just tried to be faithful with the little I had. And somehow God used that, not because I'm special, but because He is." The congregation sat in reverent silence when she finished. Then, one by one, they stood. Not in applause, but in respect. A standing ovation of presence rather than noise. Margaret saw tears on many faces. She saw understanding dawning in eyes that had been blind, and she realized that her suffering hadn't been meaningless. It had been transformed into something that could heal others. Pain with purpose. That's what redemption looked like. After the service, a young woman approached Margaret. She introduced herself as Patricia and explained that she'd driven 4 hours to be there. "I saw the video," Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion, "and it saved my life, not metaphorically, literally. I was planning to end things. I'd lost everything, my job, my home, my hope. I thought I had nothing left to give the world, but then I saw you, this elderly woman giving 3 pennies, everything you had, and I thought, if she can find meaning in that, maybe I can too. Maybe my life, as small and broken as it feels, still has value." Margaret hugged this stranger-turned-sister, both women crying. "Your life has immense value," Margaret whispered fiercely. "Never doubt that. Never." They stood there for a long time, 2 souls who'd found each other across the vast distance of despair. And Margaret understood then, perhaps for the first time, the true magnitude of what had happened. It wasn't about exposing a corrupt pastor or reforming a broken church. It was about reminding people that they were seen, that their struggles mattered, that even their smallest offerings had worth. Michael kept his promise. He visited that weekend, and many weekends after. He helped Margaret fix things around her apartment, took her grocery shopping, sat with her, and listened to decades of stories. Other family members followed his lead. Suddenly, Margaret's life was filled with voices and laughter and connection. The isolation that had defined her widowhood began to crack. She wasn't just the invisible old woman anymore. She was grandma, great-aunt, friend, mentor. She was seen. A year after the incident, Riverside Community Church looked completely different. Not physically, though they'd made some changes. The real transformation was spiritual. The congregation had learned to value authenticity over appearance, service over showmanship, substance over style. They'd become a place where people could be honest about their struggles without fear of judgment. where someone could give 3 pennies and be honored for their sacrifice, where poverty wasn't treated as a character flaw, but as a reality many faced and deserved support through. Pastor Vincent's name was rarely mentioned anymore, though Margaret occasionally wondered what had become of him. She'd heard through others that he'd moved to another state, started another church. She hoped he'd learned something from what happened, but she doubted it. Some people were too committed to their own narratives to embrace truth. She prayed for him sometimes, not out of obligation, but from a genuine desire for his redemption. Even those who hurt us most are still human, still capable of change, however unlikely. On the anniversary of that transformative Sunday, Margaret stood once again at the collection plate. The church had changed its giving practices. No longer was there public collection. People could give online or drop contributions in a box at the back. It was quieter, more private, less performative. But Margaret insisted on the old way for herself. She reached into her purse and pulled out 3 pennies, the same amount as a year before. Not because she was still impoverished, she had resources now, but because those 3 copper coins had become sacred to her, a reminder of what God could do with a willing heart and a small offering. She dropped them in, and the familiar sound echoed. But this time no one laughed, no one mocked. Instead, the sound seemed to resonate with meaning, a call to remember, a summons to authenticity, a declaration that worth isn't measured in dollars, but in devotion. Margaret smiled, feeling a peace she'd rarely experienced. She'd given everything again, and once more, it was enough. Bernard caught up with her after the service. "Same 3 pennies?" he asked with a knowing smile. She nodded. "Some offerings are too important to change." He laughed, a warm sound full of affection. "You're stubborn, you know that." She grinned back. "I'm consistent. There's a difference." They walked together to the parking lot, where Michael was waiting to drive her home. Bernard waved goodbye, watching as the car pulled away, marveling once more at the extraordinary impact of an ordinary woman's simple faith. In the car, Michael glanced at his grandmother. "You gave 3 pennies again, didn't you?" Margaret shrugged. "Old habits." He shook his head, smiling. "You're not doing it out of poverty anymore, though. You're making a point." She thought about that for a moment. Maybe, or maybe I'm reminding myself of who I am. Not the woman with money in the bank, not the person strangers recognize, just Margaret, the one who loved God before anyone was watching and will keep loving him long after everyone forgets. Her grandson reached over and squeezed her hand. "They won't forget, Grandma. What you did changed people, changed me. I was living this hollow existence, chasing promotions and paychecks, thinking that's what mattered. But you showed me something deeper. That meaning comes from sacrifice, from authenticity, from being willing to give everything, even when everything looks like nothing to everyone else." Margaret squeezed back, tears blurring her vision. "You would have learned that eventually. You're a smart boy." He laughed. "I'm 34, Grandma, not exactly a boy anymore." She patted his hand. "You'll always be a boy to me." The sun was setting as they drove through town, painting everything in shades of gold and rose. Margaret looked out the window at familiar streets, at the hardware store where she lived, at the church steeple visible in the distance. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. She was different. The world hadn't changed, but her place in it had. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, known, valued, and somehow that made all the difference. That night, alone in her apartment, Margaret opened her Bible to the story of the widow's mite. She'd read it 1,000 times over the years, but tonight the words felt freshly written. Jesus sitting opposite the treasury, watching people give their gifts, the rich giving large amounts, the poor widow giving 2 small copper coins, and Jesus declaring that she'd given more than all the others because she'd given everything she had, her whole life. Margaret ran her fingers over the words, feeling their truth settle deep in her bones. She'd lived that story without even realizing it, and in living it, she'd discovered something profound, that God doesn't measure gifts by their size but by their cost. That true sacrifice is giving what you can't afford to lose. That faith looks like an empty hand and a full heart. These weren't just theological concepts anymore. They were her lived experience, her testimony, her truth. She closed the Bible and looked at the 3 pennies sitting on her table. She'd retrieved them from the collection plate with the usher's permission, wanting to keep them as a reminder. They weren't worth much, never had been, but they'd changed everything. Not because of any magic in the metal, but because of what they represented. A moment of choice. A decision to be faithful despite fear. An offering given without any expectation of return. Margaret picked up 1 penny and held it to the light. She could see her reflection distorted in the copper surface, warped, but recognizable. That's what faith did, she realized. It took our broken, distorted selves and somehow made us recognizable again. Not perfect, not fixed, but authentic, real, worthy of love despite our poverty, whether material or spiritual. The penny felt impossibly heavy in her hand, as if it contained the weight of all that had happened. She set it back down gently. Sleep came easily that night, which surprised her. She'd expected to lie awake replaying memories, processing emotions, but instead she felt a profound peace, the kind that surpasses understanding, the kind that can only come from knowing you've been faithful with what you were given. Her last thought before drifting off was a simple prayer. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for using me. Thank you for 3 pennies. In the months and years that followed, Margaret's story continued to ripple outward. Not in dramatic ways, but in quiet transformations. A pastor in another state reformed his giving practices after hearing about what happened. A wealthy businessman started a foundation specifically to help people in poverty maintain their dignity. A young seminary student changed her entire approach to ministry, determined to never prioritize budget over people. Small changes, individual decisions, but collectively they formed a wave of reform. Margaret herself settled into a quieter rhythm. She continued attending Riverside Community Church every Sunday, though now she accepted rides instead of walking. She volunteered in the food pantry they'd established, helping distribute groceries to families in need. She mentored younger women, sharing the wisdom earned through decades of faithfulness. She visited Patricia regularly, the young woman who'd driven 4 hours, watching her rebuild her life piece by piece. And every first Sunday of the month, she gave 3 pennies. Some thought it was a publicity stunt, others called it a teaching moment, but Margaret knew the truth. It was worship, pure and simple, an act of devotion that cost her something real. The amount never mattered. The heart behind it was everything. And so she kept giving, kept serving, kept showing up, not because she was trying to prove anything, but because that's what faith looked like for her. Consistent, quiet, costly. Bernard passed away 3 years after the incident. He was 91, and his death was peaceful, surrounded by family. Margaret spoke at his funeral, her voice steady despite her grief. He taught me that being seen isn't about being famous or important. It's about being truly known, about having someone witness your life and declare it valuable. He saw me when I was invisible. He defended me when I was voiceless. And in doing so, he showed me what pastoral care really looks like, not from a pulpit, but from beside you, walking with you, honoring you. The funeral was packed. People came from across the state to pay respects. And as Margaret looked at the crowd, she realized many of them were there because of what happened that Sunday years ago. Bernard had become a symbol of integrity, of standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. His legacy wasn't buildings or programs or impressive statistics. It was changed lives, restored dignity, justice served with compassion. That's what lasted. That's what mattered. Margaret lived to be 89 years old. In her final days, surrounded by family who loved her, she reflected on a life that had seemed so small for so long. I was nobody, she whispered to Michael, who held her hand. Just an old widow with 3 pennies. He squeezed gently, tears streaming down his face. You were never nobody, Grandma. You were faithful, and that made all the difference. She smiled, her eyes already seeing beyond this world. Tell them, she said, her voice fading. Tell them it doesn't matter how much you have. It matters what you do with it. Tell them to give everything, even when everything looks like nothing. Tell them God sees. Always, He sees. Those were her last words. A final testimony from a woman who'd learned that the smallest offerings, given with the largest hearts, can change the world. At her funeral, they displayed 3 pennies in a small frame. Underneath, a plaque read, "She gave everything." Thousands attended. People whose lives had been touched by her story, her example, her faithfulness. They came from across the country, some from other countries, all to honor an ordinary woman who'd done an extraordinary thing. She'd given what she had, and in doing so, she'd given us all permission to do the same. The preacher who spoke was young, probably in his 30s. He'd become a pastor specifically because of Margaret's story. I never met her, he admitted to the crowd, but she changed my life. I was on a path toward becoming exactly what Pastor Vincent was, focused on success, growth, numbers. Then I saw that video, watched her drop 3 pennies while being mocked, and I realized I'd been measuring everything wrong. Size doesn't matter. Sacrifice does. Appearance means nothing. Authenticity means everything. He paused, emotion thick in his voice. Margaret gave us a gift. Not just her 3 pennies, though those were precious. She gave us a template for genuine faith. She showed us what it looks like to keep showing up, keep giving, keep serving, even when no one notices. Especially when no one notices, because ultimately we're not performing for an audience, we're offering our lives to God. And He sees, He always sees. The service ended with communion, and as people filed forward to receive the bread and wine, they passed by those 3 pennies in their frame. Small, insignificant to most eyes. But in the story of one woman's faith, they'd become priceless. A reminder that God doesn't need our abundance. He asks for our availability, our willingness, our whole hearts, even when our hands are empty. Michael stood by his grandmother's casket for a long time after everyone left. He was the last one there, the funeral director waiting patiently in the back. He looked at her peaceful face and remembered all the weekends he'd spent with her after that first visit. All the stories she'd shared, all the wisdom she'd imparted. "Thank you," he whispered, "for showing me what matters, for teaching me that a life of faithfulness is never wasted, for your 3 pennies. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 pennies. Pennies he'd been carrying for 3 years, ever since she'd first told him the whole story. He placed them gently on her casket, a final offering. "I'll keep giving mine too, Grandma. I promise. Not because anyone's watching, but because you taught me that's what faith looks like. Small, consistent, costly, real." As he walked out of the funeral home into the bright afternoon sun, Michael felt something shift inside him. Grief, yes, but also determination. He would live differently now, not chasing empty success or hollow achievements, but pursuing the kind of quiet faithfulness his grandmother had modeled. The kind that gives everything, even when everything looks like nothing. The kind that trusts God sees, even when no one else does. Years later, Michael would tell his own children about their great-grandmother, about the day she gave 3 pennies and changed everything, about how sometimes the smallest actions have the largest impacts, about how God doesn't measure gifts by their size but by their sacrifice, and he would pull out those same 3 pennies, worn now from being carried in his pocket, and let his children hold them, feel their weight, understand their value. "These aren't worth much," he'd tell them. "Maybe 3 cents, but they represent something priceless. They represent what it means to give everything, to be faithful with the little you have, to trust that God can use anything, even copper coins, to accomplish His purposes. Your great-grandmother taught me that, and now I'm teaching you. Pass it on." And they would. One generation teaching the next. One story inspiring countless others. One woman's simple act of devotion echoing through time. Because that's how kingdom work happens. Not through grand gestures or impressive displays, but through ordinary people doing extraordinary things, through widows giving pennies, through children sharing birthday money, through strangers becoming family, through small offerings multiplied by faithful hearts. The church where it all happened still stands. Riverside Community Church, no longer impressive in size but genuine in spirit. They keep a small memorial in the foyer, 3 pennies in a glass case. A reminder to everyone who enters that this is a place where small offerings matter, where the poor are honored, where authenticity trumps appearance, where faith is measured by sacrifice, not by success. Sometimes visitors ask about the pennies. Who gave them? What's their significance? And whoever's there tells the story. About Margaret, about Pastor Vincent, about a Sunday morning when everything changed, about how mockery turned to revelation, about how 3 copper coins exposed corruption and inspired reformation, about how one woman's quiet faithfulness sparked a movement of authentic worship. The story never gets old, because it's not really about pennies or pastors, or even one particular church. It's about the universal truth that God sees what we offer, knows what it costs us, and values the sacrifice above the size. It's about how the last can be first, how the small can be great, how the invisible can be undeniable. It's about hope for everyone who's ever felt their contribution doesn't matter, who's ever thought they don't have enough to give, who's ever believed they're too insignificant to make a difference. Margaret's 3 pennies say otherwise. They declare that you are seen, your offering matters, your faith counts, your sacrifice is noted by the one who matters most. So give what you have, even if it's small, especially if it's costly, because in the kingdom of God, 3 pennies given in faith are worth more than fortunes given for show, and the sound of copper coins falling into a wooden plate can echo through eternity, changing everything they touch. If this story moved you, helped you, or made you think differently about faith and sacrifice, please share it with others who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that matter. And remember, you don't need much to make a difference, just faithfulness, just willingness, just 3 pennies and a willing heart. Until next time, may you find the courage to give everything, even when everything looks like nothing.